Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the 1 p.m. Eastern Time session for today's symposium on educational equity into social studies. Now, we learned a lot about NAEP and the design of NAEP and the way samples are constructed and how results are reported and disseminated this morning. And so today, this afternoon, we'll focus now on some examples of research that has been conducted with the NAEP social studies data sets. Rich Lambert will start us off, and then I'll follow him. And then again, we'll have time for questions from those of you in the audience. So let me introduce Rich. Rich Lambert is a professor in the Department of Educational Leadership in the Cato College of Education at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, and director of the Center for Educational Measurement and Evaluation. His research interests include formative assessment for young children, applied statistics, and teacher stress and coping. Rich, thanks for joining us here today. I'm going to stop my share so that way you can, if you have to share the screen, you can do that.
Yeah, let me get to my slides here. Oh, what did I do? That's not what I want. All right, I'll be with you in 1 second.
Sure.
Here we go. Let me get into presentation mode. Okay, so what I wanted to go through is just some examples from the research that our team has done using NAEP social studies achievement data. I'm also going to give you an overview of findings of some of our previous studies. I'm going to focus mainly on one that directly involved the NAEP US history. But then I want to illustrate just very quickly some findings from some other studies. We've done a number of studies in our team using large federal data sets and multi-level model. I want to go over just from the experiences of our research team using large data sets like NAEP, just some of the methods issues that we've encountered that might get people thinking about, issues that apply to their own research, and then some directions for future research that we've been thinking about on our team. Okay, so what did we do with history content knowledge? Well, we were trying to look at predictors of NAEP US history scores. And this is a complicated topic, and we were trying to disentangle the interconnections of student instructional exposure, and we'll talk a little bit about how we define that, but also the sociological, sociocultural context of schools and how all those things relate to history content knowledge. This work comes against a backdrop of complicated historical connections between things like race and gender and the acquisition of or learning of history content knowledge. For example, students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds often lack the cultural capital or even receive less parental involvement or face lower academic expectations, all of which can negatively impact their student achievement. It's well known, it's one of the sort of cornerstones that we know about in educational research. Well, it applies to things like NAEP as well. Studying something like the NAEP US history exam also comes with a further complicating factor that history assessment policies lack federal mandates, right? So there's inconsistent assessment and testing going on across states. So what were we looking at in this particular study? Well, we were looking at whether student level sociocultural characteristics were associated with US history content knowledge. Similarly, was it types of instructional exposure associated with their scores on the test, and were school level demographics and some information about the accountability context that the school function is. In other words, state policies about assessment. Were those associated with US history content? And then do school level characteristics serve as moderating effects on racial achievement gaps as evidenced by US history content knowledge? Everyone can hear me okay? Sometimes my audio goes in and out. We good?
Yep, I can hear you. We can hear you.
All right, so just to give you a little bit of the structure of the study, as we learned this morning in the first session, these are large data sets, right? Well, the one we used the 2010 U.S. history NAEP exam scores. We had approximately 11,000 students. Those 11,000 students were nested in approximately 400 schools. So that lent itself naturally to doing multi-level modeling. We also attached some other data to those scores. So we had student demographics, but we also included student report of instructional exposure. So it's not necessarily exactly what did happen in the classroom, but we heard, of course, a little bit about the student surveys this morning. And we created some scale scores using the student survey data and attached those to the achievement data. We also used Education Week's 2010 Quality Counts Survey of state level testing policy. And then we had the opportunity to include some interesting student level covariates, which are worth commenting about quickly. We used student self-report of their interest in US history. In other words, if students are not particularly interested in the course, that may be associated with some of the variability in the scores. We also used whether the student was taking a history course at the time. We used the 12th grade scores, and so the students could report, were they also taking a history class at that time? And then we used another covariate, had they ever taken the AP US history course? So as I said, we used the grade 12 part of the NAEP US history exam. And basically we were trying to think of it as representing kind of an accumulation of US history content knowledge over time. Not to repeat what we focused on this morning, but just to, in a nutshell, to talk about, we have to remember this is a low stakes assessment. Right? The students who were taking it were not taking it for a grade, nor was it being used to evaluate teacher performance in any way. That's not what NAEP is designed to do. Rather, the value of NAEP, again, just to repeat a little bit or review, lies in its national sampling frame and the generalizability. In other words, whatever it's measuring, it's doing so in a nationally representative and large scale way. So it serves as the most comprehensive cross-sectional assessment of US history content knowledge. And I guess you could say conceptual development that there is in the nation. However, there's some tensions that are worth a little bit of attention right now. There's a tension between trying to measure the breadth of content knowledge that the student has gained against, are we really measuring their analytical skills or their historical skills that are higher order thinking related to the content. So there's a tension to that. I guess a lot has been written by detractors that suggest that NAEP scores don't really capture a real complexity of historical thinking. Others argue that tests like NAEP provide some kind of baseline of student understanding of our common historical narrative or of a common historical narrative. And it's a narrative, of course, that can be up for critique, but it may be essential for researchers to kind of contextualize where the nation's students are in understanding, gathering historical knowledge. We found it as a team a little bit challenging to accept that the NAEP US history scores are representative of real higher order historical thinking, but we defined our findings in terms of a general knowledge of some student content knowledge acquisition and maybe first order reasoning skills. So what did we find? I'm going to give you a little bit of quick overview of some of our findings related to student characteristics, instructional strategies that the students reported experiencing, and something about school characteristics. So first thing we did was looked at the interclass correlation coefficient. The ICC was 0.2. What this means in a nutshell is that of all the variance in the scores, the variability in the scores, about 20% of that was between schools, which means, of course, 80% of it was between students within the same school. And not surprisingly, a lot of the well-known achievement gap issues that we see in educational research so frequently were replicated with this particular study of NAEP US history scores. For example, non-white, non-Asian students scored lower than white or Asian students, and the effect size there was about 1/3 of a standard deviation. So there is an achievement gap in this sense. Also, male students were scored higher than female students, effect size was about 0.2 standard deviation units. Students qualifying for the National School Lunch Program, or of course we all know a proxy for being from an economically disadvantaged family, scored lower than those who did not qualify. College-bound students scored higher than non-college-bound students. So not really anything surprising, but showing us that well-known achievement gaps are present in the NAEP US history exam, just like there are a lot of other things. Okay, then we moved on to the students' reported instructional experiences, and that variable matter. What we did was we took items from the student survey and we did some factor analysis and measurement work, came up with a set of items that basically represented text-based instruction. How much text-based instruction did the students perceive that they received? And then another score, how much multimodal instruction did they report receiving? In other words, things other than text-based instruction. Students who reported more text-based instruction scored higher. Students who reported more multimodal instruction scored lower. The other kind of interesting finding was the combination of text-based and multimodal instruction diminished the advantages of text-based instruction. So in other words, it's a little bit complex finding, so like an interaction term in the model, but if students were reporting high amounts of both, they tend to do better. They tended to do worse than students who just reported a high amount of text-based instruction. So, interesting. We also had a number of interesting findings related to building level features, and they matter to achieve. So perhaps not surprisingly, because of the achievement gap issue, when you go up to the second level, to the building level, schools with higher concentrations of Black students have lower average scores. Schools with higher concentrations or lower concentrations of college-bound students have lower scores. State policy or testing policy context mattered as well. So when a school was operating in a state that included social studies tests, the scores tended to be on average higher. And there were some interesting findings. These are a little bit complex, but there was some evidence that text-dependent instruction did decrease the gap between white and Asian students. The gap was, well, there were some non-white, non-Asian students who reported a lot of text-based instruction who had higher scores and smaller gap than non-white, non-Asian students who were not reporting being exposed to a lot of text-based instruction. So it's kind of an interesting finding addressing potentially the achievement gap issue. So I just wanted to go through, in addition to what we've done specifically with NAEP, the idea that we've explored a number of other large-scale data sets, sometimes for the purpose of matching things to NAEP scores, but other times just for purposes of looking at multi-level modeling for other related educational policy questions. So, for example, maybe some of you are aware of the Schools and Staffing Survey. It's a large nationally representative sample of teachers across the country. Asks all kinds of questions about working conditions and instructional practices and preparation, training, etc. That data set, that survey is no longer being collected, but its following survey is, and it's now called the National Teacher and Principal Survey. We've done a lot of interesting work with that. Most recently, we've been looking at multi-level modeling and nesting teachers within their schools and looking at whether their race and ethnicity identification is congruent or not congruent with the majority of the students in their schools. And we're finding some differences related to perceived stress levels, job satisfaction, working conditions, instructional practices, and so on, based on whether they are racially or ethnically congruent with the students in their schools. So very interesting stuff there. We've used the Common Core of Data, which was mentioned in the presentation this morning. It's a large database that you can easily access through the National Center for Education Statistics that has a lot of information about structural characteristics of all school buildings in the United States. We've used, as I mentioned in previous slides, the quality counts data. Quality counts data gives you a survey of state education policy issues. And so we've done a number of different studies where we've nested teachers or students within their state policy climate to see if those things matter to what we're studying. And then more recently, we've been starting to look at the Stanford Education Data Archive and the Civil Rights Data Collection, which is also from the US Department of Education. So just a quick word about those. Both of these data sets are organized by the CCD school ID. So you can match them to other federal data sets based on that. And what the Stanford data is attempting to do is come up with kind of a student achievement metric for all schools in the United States. And so they've kind of standardized to a strategy that they developed for comparing schools and their achievement levels to other comparable local schools, I guess you could say. And then the Civil Rights Data Collection looks at a lot of educational outcomes with some things like suspensions and other discipline-related outcomes. But that's organized by race and ethnicity and organized by school, so you can match that on as well. So anyway, I just wanted to point out, just from a standpoint of thinking about opportunities to use these large federal data sets, a lot of this stuff can be matched to things like NAEP or to other data sets and give you even a richer picture of the school context. Okay, so a couple of other findings from some of our other multi-level studies that not exactly using NAEP achievement scores, but I just wanted to point to them because they might raise some ideas in some folks' mind about how some of these large federal data sets can be used. So in a study using the Schools and Staffing Survey, we found that elementary teachers working in states that require social studies testing spent more time on social studies instruction. Maybe not surprising, but we found it with a large nationally representative data set that the accountability policies may, at least in part, be associated with how much time in elementary schools is dedicated to social studies teaching. Teachers reporting greater levels of instructional autonomy spent more time teaching social studies as well. So one of the things we've done is created, and it's common, a lot of folks have done it, you can create some different scale scores from some of these teacher perception measures and surveys. One of the ones we've created and used in a number of studies is how much autonomy the teacher feels. And that seems to be related to how much instructional time they devote to teaching social studies. Now, another curious finding, though, that goes with these first two is that elementary teachers working in states with social studies testing also reported less autonomy. So, teachers that are in states that don't have as much testing tend to feel a little bit more professional independence or autonomy. So it's kind of an interesting, kind of complex picture when you think about how teachers choose to use instructional time related to social studies instruction and compare that to sort of, relatively speaking, how much professional autonomy do they perceive to make those kinds of instructional decisions. We have a second publication that looked at very similar research questions. And again, state testing policy was a significant predictor of elementary teachers' reported time spent on social studies instruction in the predicted direction, right? If you're working in a state that has testing, then you tend to focus more on that content area. And then teachers' perception of workplace autonomy, again, was associated with increased time spent on social studies instruction. Now, I wanted to shift gears then to just kind of thinking through some of the methods issues that our team has faced, and just might get some of you thinking about how you can use some of these data sets. The first thing to remember about NAEP, at least from my standpoint, is that schools are the primary sample. And that was explained this morning in more detail. What was also introduced this morning was the idea that you can go on the site, produce reports, look at subgroup comparisons. It's important to remember when you do that NAEP has a specific recommendation for subgroup comparisons. They pretty much want you to restrict yourself to situations where there is sufficient data. And they define that as at least 62 students from at least 5 primary sampling primary sampling units or schools. So if you don't have a subgroup that can at least come up to that minimum standard, it's probably not advisable to use them in comparisons. Next, just remember, of course, there's a naturally nested structure to the data when you use something like NAEP, right? Students are within classrooms, but they're also within schools, and they're also in the state policy climates, right? So there's ways you can use that to your advantage, as we have in a number of our studies. As I mentioned, it's really a nice advantage that you have the Common Core of data, CCD or NCES school ID number in a lot of these data sets. So you have the possibility to match from other databases. Like, for example, we showed we've attached state data, we've attached school data to both teacher and student data for different studies that we've done. And then, of course, with NAEP data, you have to be careful about using software that will accommodate a plausible values algorithm. So just for example, we've used some algorithms in Stata, in R, and in the HLM software to address multi-level modeling with plausible values. A couple of other things to think about, and this was mentioned briefly this morning as well. There's not just the achievement scores that you can think about modeling, right? There's student questionnaires, teacher questionnaires, and school questionnaires. And the student questionnaires include information about student demographics, but also questions about opportunity to learn in and out of the classroom, exposure to different instructional strategies, different community resources, etc. Teacher questionnaires often focus on things like teacher training, teachers' reported instructional practices, teachers' perceptions of their working conditions, etc. School questionnaires talk about school policies, right, and school structural characteristics. So all this gives you, and this is something we've done a lot of, opportunities for theory-driven dimension reduction. What I mean is basically creating scale scores from student, teacher, and survey items, school survey items. Now, everybody might not necessarily agree. Some folks have published a lot with some of these large federal data sets without doing so. But, you know, coming from a measurement background, it seems silly not to take advantage of the opportunity to have, you know, a large set of items to play around with and make more stable and reliable, potentially even more valid representations of the theoretical constructs you're trying to include in your studies, potentially making something that's much more researcher friendly than simply a single item score might be, for example. So we've had a lot of success with exploring scale score development, calibrating scale scores using the measurement model, and specifically we've done a lot with the Roche partial credit model, because a lot of these questions are, you know, like Likert scale style attitudinal questions. And so they work real well with, you know, making scale scores like that. A couple of other things to comment about. We have done some differential item functioning studies. This is looking at potential for bias or evidence that might suggest item bias, but at minimum, it's looking at whether items function differently for different subgroups. And what we found is just, I think, a word of caution. We have some publications about this. The test items and the survey items may not have the same meaning or the same difficulty level for all subgroups of, say, students or all subgroups of teachers. For example, one of our recent publications, we saw that some of the survey items don't really function the same way for elementary teachers that they do for high school teachers. You know, it's just some natural contextual differences might mean you have to be careful about how you use the items. The same item might not mean the same thing to a 5th grade teacher than it means to a 12th grade history teacher. So anyway, just a word of caution about that. It's also important to be looking at, from a validity standpoint, what differential item functioning related to you know, the items on something like NAEP. It's also curious to me how much of these teacher and student and school level self-report kind of survey items, how do they actually map onto what the actual pedagogical practices in the classroom were, right? So there may be a need for future studies to look at validation or verification, if you will, of how those student or teacher self-reports function. For example, it would be wonderful if we could somehow do some mixed method studies that include classroom observations and interviews with teachers to look at how other sources of information map onto what the students and teachers report happened in the classroom. Another thing I want to point out is we've got a really interesting preliminary findings. We've just got a lot more work to do with it, but we think about things like NAEP as being useful for looking at achievement gaps, right? Well, we've done some preliminary analysis that show that in the Department of Defense schools, there's a much smaller, if not negligible, achievement gap in social studies achievement compared to what you see nationally when you look at the entire data set. Now, what might be going on there? Well, we got a lot more work to do. This is not ready for prime time or publication yet, but the idea that the military has focused a lot more and a lot longer on being more of an equal opportunity kind of employer and having better working conditions for historically minoritized populations. Of course, it has some selection bias involved too, right? I mean, perhaps if you're looking at a Department of Defense school in Germany, the children of Black officers or something there, maybe they're not the same population as you'd be looking at when you look at the achievement gap nationally. But anyway, it's something to point out and to be thinking about and maybe follow up with future research on. So that's kind of the end of my quick and dirty overview of a lot of stuff we've done over the years. I've included some of our references here at the end if anyone's interested. So let me stop sharing and we'll give it back to Michael, but I hope at least I was able to give some ideas about how some of these data sets can be used.
Yeah, absolutely, you did, Rich. Thank you so much. I know later this afternoon we're going to look at methods of linking the NAEP achievement data to other large-scale federal data sets, but the ones that you provided were new to me, and I think it really does open up some pretty interesting opportunities for empirical research. So thanks for that. I'll ask the attendees to think about questions they would like to post. And what I think we'll do is we'll proceed to the next presentation, and then once we're done with that one, we'll come back and we'll look into the Q&A to see what questions we have, and we'll get to those. So let me share my screen. Okay, so Rich just gave us an overview of some of the work he and his colleagues have done with the NAEP US History Assessment. My focus is going to be on the geography assessment. In geography education, we've known for a long time about the gaps in the achievement gaps in our subject area, but we have not had explanations of them. And so what we're doing now is we are beginning to mine all available NAEP achievement data from 1994 to 2018. And to get at those answers, we need to proceed in phases. So the first phase is a study, student and school level predictors of geography achievement in the United States. Michael Solom and my colleague Phil Vaughn is here as well this afternoon. And what I'd like to do is to summarize some of the findings from this study, and then I'll begin to show how we're moving to build upon this descriptive analysis into looking at some of these opportunity to learn variables that Rich mentioned in his study. So in our project, let me see, I'm trying to advance, here we go. Our project had 3 research questions. What is the variation in geography achievement at the 8th grade within and between schools? How has that changed over time? How are student characteristics associated with geography achievement at the 8th grade level? And what are the gaps between student groups? How has that changed over time? And then finally, how are school characteristics associated with geography achievement at the 8th grade? Gaps between schools, how has that changed over time? And so like Rich has done and his colleagues, we use this methodology of hierarchical linear modeling. And what we did here is create a two-level model using student and school level characteristics as independent predictor variables. And we wanted to choose variables that appeared across all of the 5 existing geography assessments. And we set the outcome variable to the plausible values of theta for the NAEP composite geography score. And then we calculated random intercept for, or estimated that random intercept for the model. So those the level 1 predictors are the student characteristics, sex, race, ethnicity, free reduced lunch eligibility, and so forth. And then the level 2 predictors you see here, these are the school level attributes. So geographic reason, urbanicity, school composition, etc. And so with regard to our first research question, we're trying to get to the extent that within and between school differences explain the variation in achievement. And so like Rich did in his study, we calculated what's called the unconditional intra-class correlation coefficient, defined there as the ratio of the amount of variance due to groups relative to the total variance. Values, ICC values range from 0 to 1, with lower values representing greater within group variability, i.e. geography achievement among students within a school. And so here are calculated results. You can see it's fairly consistent over the 5 assessment years that really the variation is mostly attributable to within school differences. I think Rich's calculation in his study was about 0.2, so a little bit difference, which I think is interesting between the 2 subject areas, but maybe that's something we can discuss. So within school differences, what happens within schools is really what explains is associated with most of the variation in the data set. And now for the second research question, looking at the student characteristics, what I'm going to do here is summarize the results for the student characteristics that were significant across all 5 assessments. And so these are those variables that you see along the top. And so with each of these student variables, the model is going to generate an estimate relative to a comparison group. So for female, the comparison between male, Black, and Hispanic to white, eligible for the National School Lunch Program versus not eligible, students who are classified as with learning disabilities on an IEP or individualized education plan versus those who are not classified as an IEP student, English language learners versus those who are not classified as an English language learner, above modal age at the 8th grade. And then we have 2 ordinal variables, parental education and number of books in home, which are taken as proxy variables for socioeconomic status. And so on the y-axis, we're reporting the results in theta units. So a 0 approximate mean of 0, and then trending up would be a standard deviations away from at the mean, and then standard deviation below the mean. Okay, so what you want to do is focus on that 0 with regard to the trend data that I'm about to show. Okay, let's start with the results on gender. We can see here that in 1994, the model estimates that female students will perform about 0.06 standard deviations lower, and that gap widened by the time we get to 2018 to about 0.2 standard deviations lower. And again, these are, keep in mind that these are statistically independent coefficients, everything else conditional in the model, all the other holding conditional, all the other variables in the model. So on the basis of race ethnicity, we can see in 1994, Black students achieved a 0.6 standard deviations lower, and that is about the same as in 2018. However, we do see an interesting little rise between 2001 and 2010. This is something that I think we should look into in order to begin to figure out, well, what explains that particular trend, and then the subsequent widening of the achievement gap. The achievement gap for Hispanic is a bit lower. In 1994, almost 4 standard deviations lower. But we do see a narrowing of the gap into the most recent assessment of about 2.2 standard deviations lower on the geography assessment. So for students eligible for free reduced lunch, it's similar, trending around 0.2 standard deviations lower over the study period. But the largest achievement gaps we can see for students who are classified IEP, students with disabilities. These are pretty large effects, from almost 0.75 standard deviations lower 1994, and about that point as well in 2018. And we see post 2001 that achievement gap really starting to widen. And it's a fairly similar pattern for students who are classified as English language learners. On the basis of age, students who are above modal age, there's a slight gap in achievement, about 0.05 standard deviations lower across the study period. And then with regard to our other indicators, both highest level educational attainment by a parent, it's associated with increasingly higher standard deviations in achievement on the geography assessment. Similarly, books in home, with each incremental increase in number of books at home, there's a commensurate increase in achievement on the geography assessment. There were other student variables that had significant associations with achievement in certain years, but these were the characteristics that were consistent and significant across all 5 of the assessments. Now, with regard to our school level predictor variables, there was much less consistency in the results. One thing I think it's interesting, that unlike Rich's studies, we didn't find any significant associations on the basis of school composition. I think that's something that I would like to talk with Rich about, and others about, why that may be the case. Some future research opportunity, I think. Based on school sector, we only saw a couple of years. In 1994, private schools were predicted to score 0.22 standard deviations higher, but that reversed in 2001. After 2001, we didn't see a significant association on the basis of school sector. And the first year we saw anything significant to report with regard to urbanicity was in 2018. Suburban schools, 0.09 standard deviations higher, rural schools, 0.13 standard deviations higher. Well, it was the only year that we had a significant association with urbanicity. And then region, again, not much consistency in the results, but there you see what we do have in terms of significant associations on the basis of school type and region. Okay, so really what that gets us to now is that we have a pretty clear sense now empirically of the nature of the variation in the geography achievement data, primarily associated with student characteristics. And we also know that this is not an aberration. This inequality is enduring. It is nationally representative of the student groups. And the within school differences really, I think, compel us to look into research and interventions that give special attention to equity and outcomes in U.S. geography education. And so to prepare for that, we're getting started on the follow-up deeper analysis of the NAEP geography data sets. And I see this going along 2 tracks. The first one is looking at relationship between achievement and opportunity to learn, which Rich defined a little bit, and so did Emmanuel, and I'll talk about a little bit more here too. And then I think the second track will be looking into geography achievement in relation to geographic inequalities in education. After this session at 3 p.m. Eastern time, we're going to be looking at other federal data sets that really can support geographical analysis of outcomes in schooling. So really we're looking at geography education and the geography of education in terms of these 2 tracks of research moving forward. Let's start with opportunity to learn. So as I mentioned, we really don't know the extent that geography education influences student outcomes at the national level in geography. But we can further mine NAEP data to help us identify what factors appear to be responsible for those gaps and trends which I just showed you. And so the opportunity to learn consists of categories related to curriculum. Think of how heterogeneous our educational landscape is with regard to curriculum content coverage, grades in which geography is offered, standards and assessment policies, etc. Opportunity to learn also touches on instructional differences. Those are the types of variables that NAEP data also contain. Teacher characteristics along those lines, and also some more information about school resources. So these are the deep data sets that, alongside the achievement data, NAEP collects to permit research looking into relationships between the achievement outcomes and the so-called opportunity to learn variables. So in order to get us started in the hunt for the variables that we really want to take a more closer look at, we have a group of doctoral students at my university who began to use a tool that Emmanuel talked about this morning called the NAEP Data Explorer. It's really a accessible, easy to use tool, and that supports some preliminary explorations into the NAEP data set. So here's an example. I mean, I pulled the results for average scale scores for grade 8 geography on the environment and society content domain, comparing those scores by students who took geography in the 6th grade. And so on that output, you can see that students who took geography in the 6th grade had a significantly higher score compared to those who reported they did not, or actually schools that reported they don't study geography in the 6th grade. And so, you know, this is not causal research by any means. You know, we're not, unlike with multi-level modeling, we're not accounting for covariates in the data. We're not accounting for intercorrelations in the student characteristics. But again, I think this data explorer tool is pretty handy because it helps us flag variables such as when is geography offered, curriculum organization, as something that we want to look into, add into our multi-level modeling to really try to narrow down its significance in terms of achievement as a predictor of achievement. Let's take a look at some of the examples of the findings from these graduate students. So Jan and Heather, they did a study that focused on teacher quality variables. And so what they're looking at is they conduct a significance test, looking at relationships between these types of OTL variables on teacher quality and geography achievement. They found higher levels of achievement were associated with teachers with more than 10 years of teaching experience, teachers who participate in workshops, conferences, participate on curriculum committees, and independent reading in the social studies. So this is an example of what we want to do is, one thing we could do with NAEP data is we can calculate the extent that different student groups have access to, say, more experienced teachers or teachers who pursue these types of professional development. And we can take those variables and add them as another level in our existing 2-level model to see how they are associated with the gaps and trends over that study period from 1994 to 2018 to try to get a sense to which the magnitude of those achievement gaps may be due to differential access to teacher quality. So next, another topic was curriculum content organization. Licha and Kelly chose this one. And so here are some of their findings. They found higher levels of achievement associated with students who learn geography in the 5th, 6th, and 7th grade. And schools that offer social studies as discrete subjects. So standalone courses in geography as opposed to integrated social studies courses. And so again, we want to look into the extent that in the nation, students have access to geography instruction in those earlier grades, as well as access to discrete geography courses. But we also want to take those variables and put them into our multi-level model to really identify how significant these variables are for explaining those achievement gaps and trends. Now, one limitation I think is involved with large-scale assessment really has to do with these curriculum variables, because especially in a subject like geography, which a lot of times we think as a very horizontal subject. And by that, I mean, when students are asked if they learn about countries and cultures, natural resources, environmental issues, well, what exactly are they thinking about in terms of what environmental issues and what natural resources, which countries, which cultures? And I don't think we can really get at that type of contextual nuance with NAEP. And it's going to really require, I think, different approaches to research, perhaps more qualitative types of research to really get into some of these questions about curriculum subject matter and their associations with student outcomes and attitudes. Speaking of attitudes, Michael and Zach took a look at some variables associated with teacher and student attitudes and relationships to achievement. So they found higher levels of achievement associated with students who indicate geography as a favorite subject, students who believe geography improves their understanding of the world, teachers who are satisfied being teachers, teachers who discuss the individual educational needs of students. These are, again, just some other variables that this preliminary exploration of the data set is suggesting that we may want to take a closer look at by adding them into our multi-level model. And the final example will be USIX, who took a look at uses and applications of technology. And USIC found higher levels of achievement associated with home access to computers and various digital devices. Here it could be, more of like a socioeconomic factor that's important. Students who use computers to create multimedia reports. Students who search the internet for sources of evidence. This is something that in social studies education is encouraged in terms of understanding primary and secondary sources. And then that's what we want to do. Again, looking at access in terms of the extent different student groups may have access to these types of technologies at home and in the school, and we'll work these variables in to our multi-level model to look at their association with achievement gaps over that study period. And so there is just how we're starting to now move from that descriptive analysis into further mining the NAEP data sets, trying to look into opportunity to learn, trying to get a sense of how we can begin to reach explanations for the gaps and trends in achievement over that study period. Because if we can get some explanations, then perhaps we can begin to fashion policies and interventions that can help students succeed in geography education. And that was the grant that funded this descriptive analysis that I described to you, which I'm obligated to acknowledge. And so thank you for your attention. And again, coming up at 3 o'clock is going to be a discussion about other ways of approaching the analysis of achievement data, really focusing more on the geography of education. And so we'll be looking at some really great examples of how this can be done coming up at 3. But we do have some time for questions and answers. And I see some here. Joe, you may need to retype yours because it looks like it may be cut out here. But Ashley, let me see what you have.
He did retype it in, I think I don't know, I got the question somehow through another window, so.
Oh, okay. Okay, I see it. Okay. So did you examine performance on the NAEP? Can you respond to that, Rich?
Yeah, so just for whatever it's worth, I mean, I think it's an excellent question. The way to rephrase it would be, what do we know is really being measured with these student reports of more text-based instruction or more multimodal instruction? And, you know, we didn't look specifically at the validity of those items. And this is one of the things that over the years has prompted me to still keep, every time we write one of these papers, to call for more mixed method studies where people would actually sort of go out and interview and observe in classrooms and find out what is the real correspondence between what actually happens and what the students or the teachers say happens. That might be a little tough to do, might be expensive, but I think it's something we need to investigate further. So it's a great question. The question also asked about one of the citations in my final slide. The one where we did differential item functioning, most recent one was about, I think, teachers reporting of working conditions from the National Teacher and Principal Survey. So it was not directly from one of the NAEP questionnaires, but that's another source that you could potentially match on to get teacher perceptions of their working environment and of their instructional practices. And the questions are, I think you could argue, maybe more extensive than what the NAEP questionnaires do, right? So it's another source to potentially go to about use of instructional time and different things like that.
Yeah, you know, I realize in terms of that finding about text-dependent instruction and you call it multimodal, I think, instruction. We're some of the NAEP Data Explorer material that, you know, and I think I just let me try to stop the share because I need to reshare and show you something. I realized I glanced over part of USIC's finding, and it touches on this question of multimodal instruction. So let me reshare that. And it had to do with students reporting greater amounts of learning with GIS, and using GIS, geographic information systems, to create and use maps was actually associated with lower levels of achievement. And we find a similar pattern with other variables, frequency of going on geography field trips, frequency of doing inquiry and problem solving. These types of things being associated with lower levels of achievement. Now, before people start to panic, again, it's like, you know, these are a lot of things we like associate with being the signature pedagogies of geography. But you have to, I think, two things. One, we have to really get into more of the multi-level modeling to really address covariates and intercorrelations in the data set, number one. However, the fact that some of this preliminary, these patterns we can see in the preliminary investigations correspond to, you know, findings that Rich and his colleagues have found that increasing exposure to multimodal pedagogies, lower levels of achievement on the NAEP assessment, really, I think, we really need to stop and thinking about what's happening here and why. I mean, we have to remember that NAEP is really a knowledge assessment. And so is what happening a trade-off? And that, you know, if teachers are really focusing their classroom time on these active pedagogies or multimodal pedagogies, are they doing so without a concurrent objective for the students to acquire content knowledge? And maybe acquiring skills or learning new software, or learning how to work in groups, make observations, which are all worthwhile educational aims. But what I think the question for me that the NAEP results raise is, to what extent may they be spending less instructional time with a focus on helping students gain content knowledge? I think that's just a broader conversation that I see a value in the NAEP that can introduce in our respective subject areas. And one thing I would like to do, Rich, too, I mean, I had talked with Tina Hefner about this a while back.
Yeah.
But one thing I was interested in, and I asked Emmanuel this morning, is the extent that we could do some comparative studies across these social studies
Right.
subject areas to see, do does that text dependent versus multimodal instruction play out in a similar way when you look at it in the context of the geography achievement data, or are there important differences? I think it would be interesting just to look into those
Yeah,
issues.
it could be a great opportunity to collaborate. I mean, for example, if we were to try to set up the models in the same ways, right? So that we had the same covariates, perhaps even explore whether we wanted to use single items or a scale score approach and do that in the same way. It might be worth trying. I wanted to add a couple things about it. I always try to remember, and I hope I do this correctly, to say that these are really student perceptions or memories, if you will, of what their instructional exposure was. But it, as the spirit of the question we got indicates, it doesn't really get into what was the textbook, how was the textbook used, what other text-based materials besides the textbook were used. It's not that nuanced a thing. It's really what the student is reporting, what they remember. And so what I keep thinking to myself is, what would a student, a high school student's mindset be about this? My teacher made me read a lot, or my teacher showed us a lot of movies, or what is it that the high school student is really responding to? But secondly, if I reflect about all this related to my own teaching, I know that I teach statistics, and statistics education. We try to use a lot of interactive activities, a lot of software-based simulations and things like that, and they help. But if I use those without building the requisite content knowledge to understand the application, they don't work as well. And so are we dealing with some kind of complex interaction effect here that we're unable to measure with the limited survey items we have? Is there a sweet spot where you've built the right content knowledge that students can gain the most from a lot of the instructional practices we know would be ideal? And I don't think when we say they're ideal, we mean to do them as the sole delivery method for content, right? We just think of them as, at least in statistics education, we think of them more as like a, the supplemental application kind of piece, right? But this content knowledge still has to be there. So I think probably what's really happening here is something more nuanced than we can measure with these limited survey items. But nevertheless, it's definitely a great idea to think about how can we set up comparable models and look across subjects and see what we can learn. It's a great point.
Yeah, and especially when you consider that in so many cases, teachers are encouraged to teach social studies in a perhaps integrated fashion, and look at connections between the C3 framework, for example, all the messages being sent through there. So to me, it makes sense to approach some of the analysis with the NAEP social studies data, also in a way that perhaps a little more integrated, and looking at what shared variables exist that would permit these types of comparative analyses. Ashley, I see your question here. We don't have an answer for that, but what we do, one of the things that we can do is look at the affective disposition variables in the NAEP data sets that have to do with students' confidence, students' perceptions of geography, its relevance, its usefulness, their relative interest in cultures and countries, attitudes that perhaps might be associated with achievement. And I think some of the attitude results that we're finding in the preliminary studies suggest that attitudes are something that we need to think about, and think about how do we foster attitudes toward geography. We'll see the extent to which attitudes might matter once we bring some of those variables into the multi-level modeling. But thanks for pointing that out, because I think student attitudes really are important to consider as part of understanding outcomes. Looking for any other questions. Well, if we don't have any more questions, well, again, I just want to thank everybody for joining us for the second session. We will pick it up again in about 1 hour, in when we'll look at other methods and approaches of linking MAPE achievement data to federal data sets to address the significance of socioeconomic variables, but also some of the spatial context of education that may help us reach better interpretations of student outcomes. So we'll be taking a look at the importance of geographic inequalities in education coming up at 3 p.m. Eastern time. And so get a coffee break, get up and stretch, and we'll come back to Zoom. Same link as this one. Come back to Zoom in about 1 hour from now, so 3 p.m. Eastern. Thanks again, Rich.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Take care.
Bye-bye.